This is a Film Stories original podcast.
This is Writers on Film, the only podcast dedicated to books on cinema. Hello everybody and welcome to Writers on Film. My name is John Bleasdale. I'm a writer and film critic, and today I'm delighted to be rejoined by an old friend of the podcast, Jem Duducu. Thank you for joining me, Jem.
Hello again. Always a pleasure, John.
We're talking about a new book, The History of the Western. Is that the right title?
Well, yeah, Western or Western movie, publishers change it all the time. It's got cowboys on the front of it.
Excellent. Cowboys in cowboy hats. And one of the first things that I've got to ask you about is cowboy hats, because that was a fact that sort of knocked me over, that most cowboys would not wear the sort of 10-gallon hat that we associate with them, the sort of wide-brimmed John Wayne hat, but instead would be wearing derbies, which were more commonly known in England as bowler hats. Is that true?
Yeah, but it makes complete sense because they were designed for horse riding. So they got a brim to keep like the rain off you, but actually they're quite hard, so they act a bit like a crash helmet, whereas those other ones, the thing is, one fact I did not put in the book because I couldn't definitively prove it, but we talk about Westerns as being a genre, but it's actually a bit of history. It was a period of time that happened in America, and the fact I wanted to put in is I get the feeling I could probably get away with it, but it's the period of history that has been most presented in movies. Far more than the medieval era, far more than the Roman era. Probably number 2 would be the Romans, maybe number 3 would be samurai films from Japan. But it is interesting, and because of that, we might start nitpicking at like armor if it was a medieval movie, but we're so used to the Western sort of visual language that when we see photos of what it was actually like on the wild frontiers in 1880, it's like, well, they're doing it wrong. But no, that's what it's Hollywood that's been doing it wrong. But we love a good 10-gallon hat, don't we? We love a Winchester 73 and that tiny electric guitar that Ennio Morricone does magnificently in his Westerns. Of course, the electric guitar wouldn't be invented for another 80 years, but it fits. It absolutely fits the image.
This is getting to the heart of it straight away. Let's do this straight away. The definition of a Western, because from here all things will spring. We'll talk about neo-Westerns, we can talk about classical Westerns, we can talk about revisionist Westerns, but at its heart, what is a Western?
Well, funnily enough, I put that in the first chapter, and the answer is, you know it when you see it, because almost any rule you want to set, it's then broken by another movie. I mean, the classic one being, a lot of people say it's from like the 1850s to 1899. And then, sadly, this week, we've lost Robert Redford, one of the biggest grossing, one of the most well-respected, Oscar-winning Westerns of all time is Butch Cassidy and Kid. That's set in the early 1900s, so we're in the wrong era, and of course half of it is set in South America, so it ain't on the wild frontier, but it's definitely a Western. So it's one of these things where you know it when you see it. And another one I throw in there is something like Last of the Mohicans. You got shootouts, you got Native Americans, we're in the sort of like the wild frontier, but it's more musket play and redcoats, and it's like, does that count? Or indeed Leonardo DiCaprio movie The Revenant as well. That's sort of a Western, but nobody ever called it that at the time because nobody's wearing a 10-gallon hat and got a 6-shooter.
In other words, there are certain rules, a certain period of history, a certain geographical place, but those are not necessarily as important as some of the other generic signifiers, the costumes, also the narrative themes to some degree. You list a certain number of sort of plot types, which
Yes.
the small town and the marshal has the high noon plot, if you like.
Yeah.
a stranger comes to town, a fistful of dollars, high plains drifter. I mean, there was a book I read once about narrative generally that said every story can basically be broken down into two types, which one is a stranger comes to town and the other is you go on an adventure. It's like one of
Yeah,
those two.
there's a flawed book by Christopher Booker called The Seven Basic Plots. And he basically says we're just telling the same seven stories over and over again. I mean, look, it's a brilliant conceit and he does a brilliant job explaining it. The reason why I say it's flawed is the book's over 1,000 pages. It's like, mate, you had me at page 100, okay? I don't know what the rest of this is, but, you've already made a very good case. But absolutely. And you get the sort of the repetition. I mean, okay, we've already mentioned it, but obviously A Fistful of Dollars is a cowboy remake of Yojimbo. And then you've got The Magnificent Seven being a Western version of The Seven Samurai. So you can get the story, you just change the clothing and it fits very, very well in different elements. So it is interesting how flexible the Western is. It's a genre, like horror. You can have horror comedy, you can have like kids horror, for like family friendly horror, you can have gory horror, folk horror, etc. And it's the same thing with the Western. Some of the most successful Westerns have been comedy Westerns, but for something like Blazing Saddles to work, you had to have seen a few cowboy movies before Blazing Saddles, or you don't get the setups that it's kind of riffing off. Relatively recently you got Bone Tomahawk, which a lot of people like, very cult movie, but is flat out a gory horror Western. Kurt Russell obviously being fabulous in that one. So you can have art house, you can have, action, war as well. That it is interesting seeing when is it a war movie and when is it a Western? Because if you've got the US cavalry fighting the Apache Nation and their actual warriors are two military units fighting. So is that a cowboy movie or is this a war film? Discuss, but does it really matter? You've got John Wayne galloping on a horse with a big hat on shooting, so that's what the punters are paying for.
It always reminds me as well of when Polonius is describing various theatrical genres in Hamlet, and he's talking about romantic pastoral romantic, tragedy pastoral, comedy romantic. And it's so even back in Shakespeare's day, people were taking the piss out of the idea that these genres were not in any way sort of that you could easily get a mix of things from them. I mean, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly has a civil war all the way through it and is juxtaposing Clint Eastwood and Eli Wallach and Lee Van Cleef's actions with the huge actions of the country tearing itself apart. So to continue with our idea then of sort of to give a sort of historical outlook, the Western begins more or less at the same time as cinema.
I mean, probably it predates a little bit, but it is an example. And this is the thing, again, I say early on, the cowboy existed. The gunslinger was a real historical thing, but it's been turned into a legend. But then if you look at Europe, the knight in shining armor was a real thing, but it's been turned into legend. And in Japan, you got the samurai. So all three of those, we got these kind of mythic warriors who actually existed and have been sort of preserved in amber in either stories or movies. And, we tend to believe the hype rather than the historical record. But the difference between those three is when it comes to the Western, you've literally got some of the people involved in the Western. The example I gave is Wyatt Earp was literally supervising some early silent versions of the, gunfight at the OK Corral in his life, which obviously, William Marshall, the famous knight from the, Middle Ages, he couldn't have possibly done because he'd been dead for 500 years before you get to cinema. So you get this really weird, powerful, potent mixed immediately. The legend is being recorded more often and is more popular than here are the actual facts of what happened in 1872. So it is almost impossible. I feel sorry for it's not my area of expertise as a historian, but I feel sorry for the ones who have to constantly unpick, going, yeah, that never happened. Oh, it's written down for sure, but there's no way that could have happened because we know about the technology, or if you look at it, he wasn't even in that town at that time, and so on and so forth.
Yeah, there's something of the joy kill about that sort of
Yeah,
factual
yes.
checking. I mean, you mention it, and I think we've talked about this previously on another podcast about how no one could cut a rope with a bullet.
Yes.
So that
Yes.
idea
We did
in
do that before, yeah.
yes, we won't go into it, but I'm not going to pay attention to that. I'm just going to enjoy those scenes and
Exactly.
believe it happens.
Yeah, so the other thing is, I mean, I do a little bit of the technical stuff, but I really didn't want it to become a history book. But one of the things I never quite understood was in the US Civil War, we all know that they were firing muskets and having to shove the stuff down the bottom into the barrel, and you know, you could only fire twice a minute kind of thing. And yet the captains and generals had revolvers. It's like, whoa. But if you've invented the bullet, why aren't you using bullets in the muskets? And the answer is they hadn't invented the bullet yet. So if you, I encourage people to have a look at something like, priming a Colt Peacemaker. So, which is one of the first firearms. And basically what you had to do is, and you see this in things like Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, it's totally inaccurate. They've got the right gun, but they're firing bullets. But what they actually do, if you think of the barrel, there's quite often with like Clint Eastwood, there's like an extra bit under the barrel. It's like, what's that? I will come back to that in a moment. But first of all, what you do is you get the cylinder out. You then have to pour into each cylinder a bit of black powder. Then you have to put a ball into each one of those cylinders. Then while the gun's pointing up, you then put it back in. And that's what that little bit under the barrel is for. It's a lever to push it all together. Then you have to flip it around and put a little priming cap on each one of the chambers. So clearly you can't do that in the middle of a battle. But what you would have happened in the Civil War is the night before, a captain would have primed like 5 of these cylinders. So they fire off 6 shots and then they put in the next one. And it is the fastest way to fire a gun in that time. But you can see everything I'm just describing I have never seen that in a Western ever. And it's like, yeah, because it's boring. Okay. It's not, and these things were smooth bore. The bullet would come rattling out the front. You'd be lucky to hit anything. And yet the one I particularly remember is for a few dollars more, you got people firing hats off each other just to show how good they are at gunplay. And it's like, is it a great scene? Yes. Is it in any way accurate? No. But I'm not going to be a spoil sport here because we are talking, this book is about cinema. It's not about the history of the Wild West.
So as we go through the development of the Western, it goes through various phases. You have silent Westerns, you have films like The General with Buster Keaton, which is sort of a Civil War drama, comedy, I should say, and by the way, a precursor to Mad Max Fury Road. I think that's total.
Yeah.
Same plot. He goes there, he comes back again. It's absolutely the same plot.
Yeah, I'll give you that.
Yeah. George Miller's definitely watched it, no doubt about that. Then you have classical period. You have people like John Ford doing loads of westerns, John Wayne turning up. Before then, there's been a whole bunch of Western stars who nowadays we don't know as well. People like Tom Mix and Roy Rogers and all those folks, some of whom sort of bleed into the John Ford company. And is this the period in which the film Western sort of becomes, those main elements that we talked about are put in place?
Yeah, to be honest, so the earliest moving picture story, and I put this in the book, it's called Kidnapping by Indians, and it's from 1899. And it's it's less than 2 minutes long. You can see it on YouTube. And what you've got at the beginning is you've got a girl. She walks onto screen. There's a bunch of natives. They see her. They grab her. Nearby, there is a campsite of cowboys, and they see this sort of kerfuffle going on. So they bring out their guns. There is a gunfight, and then they grab the girl and keep her safe from the natives. And it's like, okay, that is less than 2 minutes. It's a very rudimentary filmmaking. That is pretty much what the Western's going to be for the next 100 years. It's remarkable how fully formed it is at the beginning. But the thing I particularly love about it is It was filmed in the Midlands in England. So, we can start talking about cultural appropriation and, colorblind casting. And, there's some very unwoke stuff going on in that one. But the reason why it was made in the first place is because while this isn't film, I do sort of start the journey with, Buffalo Bill's Wild West show. And, that was popular enough that you had people like Queen Victoria and the Kaiser of the German Empire going out of their way to see this. That's how popular the Wild West was in the world. And so immediately, like I say, the legend is already there. Bill Cody was very smart. He was literally grabbing people who were part of the Wild West story and parading them around like Sitting Bull, etc. He had nowhere else to go, so might as well earn some money out of it. Recreate the, my glory days every night and get paid for it. But it meant that the whole world wanted to know about it. Now, you never know what's in people in the past's mind unless they write it down. But America in 1880 was the back end of nowhere. The real power was in Europe. It's the era of La Belle Époque in France, the height of the British Empire, the start of a German empire, etc. In every possible way, Europe was richer and more industrialized than America. But they knew what industrial squalor was. Why not read a book or go to a show where they can hear about brave men in the frontier? It was romance. It was, if you like, getting back to your roots sort of thing. Nobody was really living in the forest in 1880 in Britain anymore. So it was a version of Robin Hood with 6-shooters, and it was absolutely lapped up. And that's preserved in it. So pretty much from the very beginning, what is a Western is there, and you can recognize it. Perhaps the first proper Western is what people tend to refer to the Great Train Robbery of 1903. But as I make the point, that was filmed while the real Butch Cassidy and Sundance Kid were actually robbing trains. How historically accurate is it? 100%. Everyone's just wearing their stuff from this year, and that's what Butch Cassidy would have seen whilst robbing trains in America. But that was filmed out in the East Coast, not in the wild frontier.
I think that's fascinating as well, that sort of overlap between the modern and the period, which is largely felt to be sort of mythical and imaginary. I think there's a sort of Whose Line Is It Anyway quiz show in America where the contestant, or somebody has a secret and the contestants have to guess what the secret is. And the secret is, as a boy, he saw Lincoln shot. And that's like in the 50s. So it's a TV show in the 50s and with an old man on it being interviewed by, I was in the theater when Lincoln got shot. And you just think, how is that possible? But of course it is. He's 8 years old when that happened and he's in his 80s or 90s. Yeah, that's it works. Going back to cinema, though, and the progression. So I keep wanting to drag you towards John Wayne and John Ford, and you're resolutely keeping me.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
That's fine.
Yeah. Well, let's get to the big people. I guess the one jump between them is right. You mentioned Tom Mix, and I find it fascinating. The only reason why I knew I had to do research on Tom Mix was because of my father. He was brought up in Turkey in the 1950s. That's about as far away as you can get from the Wild West. But he was reading comics starring Tom Mix. My mother, who's American, remembers the Tom Mix radio show when she was a little girl. I'm very bored of it because she's a girl and wasn't interested in cowboy stuff. But the point is, Tom Mix was huge. And, as I was saying in the book, at his peak, he was earning like tens of thousands of dollars a month. And that's in 1920s. You would be wealthy by today's standards. In the 1920s, that's almost obscene. But he invented the very lucrative and intelligent thing of, why do we have to keep building sets? I'm just going to build Mixville, as it became known. And so, this time I'm going to ride in from the left, and the next time I'm going to ride in from the right, and we repaint it from time to time. And that's all you need. And the thing that's really critical about Westerns is people forget that they were really cheap. And that's why they were so, I'm going to say really from the 1920s to the 1970s. So, for 50, 60 years, you knew there was a market out there. It wasn't going to cost a fortune because pretty countryside is just pretty countryside. And, just riding into the town, you just happen to rent that town for this week, and then it's your town for the week. And obviously the point of the spaghetti westerns, they've been on quite the journey in terms of their relationship, because we now tend to see them as high art, some of the great films ever. At the time, they were cheap trash. They were exploitation films, and we forget that. Obviously there can be recency bias, but the highest rated movie on Rotten Tomatoes that was never nominated for any Oscars, that's at least 20 years old, is The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. So when it came out in the 60s, it was sort of like the shockingly violent thing that teenagers went to see, and there's a lot of pearl clutching. Whereas today, it's put in the same the same level as The Godfather.
Absolutely, or Lawrence of Arabia, or some other sort
yes
your prestige production that it wasn't at the time that it came out. Even the name spaghetti western is an insulting reference, And also the other thing that links it to the Tom Mix westerns that we were talking about earlier is that they did very much do the same thing of having a place in Spain, there's a place north of Madrid and Almira, where they would, if you see enough spaghetti westerns, you see them turn up. The same places turn up again and again and again, and they've used the same sets.
Yeah, absolutely. So they are just. If this is all about economy, this is sensible filmmaking. It's a little bit like by comparison, this summer I enjoyed the most recent Mission Impossible movie, but considering none of them have done better than $700 million worldwide, why did you spend $400 million on this one? You were never going to make that money back. Why do that? I could have told you that before you even started. Do it for $200 million, you might make a profit. But even better in the world of Western, it's already built there. I spend $50,000 to rent it for a week. I, pay John Wayne $500,000 to be in this, blah, 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 blah. Whole thing costs $2 million. It makes $5 million at the box office. Mission accomplished, done. In a way, the Western...
Mission possible.
Yeah, mission, yeah. In the 30s, 40s, and 50s, Westerns were like horror movies today. They didn't cost a lot of money. They were kind of critic proof as well. You're going to make your money back on them.
There's plenty of space in the program of the cinema for, you can do a short one, you could do a long one. And then also you've sort of got freedom within that because everybody's dismissing it, because nobody's watching them that closely. There's also the freedom you have to sort of put quite subversive stuff in. So we do have films such as Shane, such as High Noon, which actually do have something to say. Even, I would argue, John Ford's Stagecoach is a really interesting and subversive piece of work.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're now into the Ford and the Hawks and obviously John Wayne as well, and we're now into sort of prime territory here. But so early on in his career, John Wayne, when he was kind of like struggling and just sort of like a stagehand, he literally met Wyatt Earp. This is a man who met a legend from the Wild West, who was making movies into the 1970s. I happened to see recently Brannigan, which was one of his last films, a very poor, police movie where he goes to Britain. And there is a very weird scene where he chases down a motorbike dispatch rider, and the dispatch rider pulls off his helmet, and it's a very young Tony Robinson. And it's like, I don't think I was ever going to see the big Duke and Baldric in the same scene in a movie, but there we are. So there's now a connection, if you like, between Tony Robinson, who's still alive today. Tony Robinson could have been told stories about Wyatt Earp from a man who met him. We're back to the sort of like he was there at the Lincoln assassination as a boy kind of thing. It does show you how recent this history is and how immediately it was subsumed by Hollywood, and I'm going to say in a good way. If America is going to start messing around with history, mess around with your own history. So have at it. Fill your boots.
Yeah, we can talk a little bit later, perhaps, about the certain angles of it, which are certainly more morally ambiguous in terms of sort of, you've already mentioned cultural appropriation, racism, but I think, in a way, I want to stress the less obvious idea. And John Ford, I remember when Quentin Tarantino was shilling his Django Unchained around, he made a point. He had a sort of bit where he had a go at John Ford because he was an extra on Birth of the Nation and all this sort of stuff. And I think, yeah, that's true. Fair enough, I guess. But John Ford's films have very complex relationships with race. They're not, Sergeant Rutledge, for
Yeah, yeah.
instance, is a film with Woody Strode as a black lead, and it's courtroom drama. Again, somewhat open to argument whether it's a Western at all in some ways. Um, the Searchers has a very complicated relationship to race.
Oh,
Even
absolutely.
even a Stagecoach that we've just been talking about has a relationship to race which is interesting. I mean, these are films in which Indians tend to get shot, tend to be the so-called villains. There is also a sense that they are fighting for something that is understandable, and so they're not sort of necessarily nameless or faceless in that sense.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, let's talk about one of the greatest westerns of all time, and one of the greatest movies of the 1950s, The Searchers. Okay, the cinematography is sensational, but it's arguably John Wayne's most complex film. And he's phenomenal in it, but he's not the good guy. He has layers there. And as people have said, it's like it doesn't quite explicitly say why he's so obsessed. But if you see at the beginning with the graves, you can see that his family's been killed by natives in the past. So if you like, today, we wouldn't take it to task because it'd be like, oh, there's an Easter egg there. Or if you're watching carefully, if you pause it on streaming, it's there. Whereas, we're now talking about the 1950s, and there was an assumption of you either go with this or you've got to be paying attention to the stuff in the background. Very, very modern filmmaking there. And yes, Natalie Woods and too many times do we get, Caucasian people or sometimes Hispanic people with, fake tan put on them, using thick, cliched accents, but again, if we believe today we are more morally, culturally, the whole diversity argument is more acceptable, and we are sort of like much better in terms of representation. If we believe that to be the case, which I do, well, if you start looking at movies in the back, well, you're rewinding all of that. So I'm sorry, but 1950s America was racist is not a shocker, and you should be able to prepare yourself for that. And the thing I really tied myself up into knots over in the book is I am always going to use the term Native American or indigenous person, or sometimes First Nations people. Okay, those are the preferred terms by those individuals, by those groups. However, it is literally in law that they live on an Indian territory. So, and an Indian reservation. So it's like, so I will use the term when it is the legal application. And I don't know, as a Westerner, as a European, if we're not using the I word anymore, why are we using it on literally reservation? Surely it could be called Native American reservation, but that hasn't happened. So yeah, I don't want to offend anybody, but there are clearly a whole bunch of minefields going on here, which back in the 1950s nobody cared. But you are getting something that is certainly suddenly holding up much more of a microscope to it isn't as simple as white guys versus red guys, goody baddie kind of thing. And also, obsession is never a good thing. And, it's brilliant that when he finally gets, his niece back again, she's been indoctrinated, for want of a better phrase. And this is loosely based on some real history. There is this, I think sometimes this willingness to say that the native people were absolutely annihilated. Absolutely. As I say in the book, at best, it's ethnic cleansing. At worst, it's genocide. But that's not to say they weren't without agency. There weren't times when there were, settlers massacred. There were times when the Seventh Army got massacred. There were moments of agency. These weren't just vegetarian peaceniks. They fought against each other. There was slavery in their culture. So it is more complicated than that. And The Searchers is absolutely a first interesting step in that direction. And that's only, I'm doing the maths here, That's less than 30 years from the very, very first sound movie. It's only, it's about 15 years from when we start getting color movies. And so, this is really quite cutting edge in the 1950s. And I think it does get respect. But again, I've got kids. I know you do too. I've made them watch some movies, some westerns, and they like them. But let's be honest, your average 20-year-old today is not going, I want to watch a western. Unless they're really into their film, it's a whole genre that's kind of faded away, and people will happily pick at the racism, sexism, etc., rather than go, is it a good film of its time? I was really talking a long time there, John. I'm sorry.
No, no, you're my guest. You are my guest. I prefer my guest to speak more than me. That's a core element of this podcast, and I love it. And I love listening to you because you know your stuff. I want to engage with you with this as well, because I mean, there's a couple of points to be made, which I don't think I don't. This isn't pushing back in any way. I think this is probably just giving a few other points which go along with your argument. First of all, John Ford was beloved of the indigenous population around Monument Valley, with whom he worked, and he supported their economy, and he encouraged them to do their traditions with the film crew and to integrate with them. And so that's one aspect that I have to point out, that they, although you have some white actors playing Scar, for instance, and playing the so-called mixed race cousin, the extras are all played by indigenous people, and so in that sense, the brown face casting was kept to a minimum, although that was not really a concern of those days. You have Burt Lancaster playing Apache in the 1960s, and others playing very crude stereotypes way into the. I mean, when was Soul Man out? That was 1980s.
Oh, he went there.
Yeah. So there is that. The other thing I would really like to argue against this idea, because I have heard podcasts. I've heard a really good podcast that I used to listen to a lot called Unspooled, and they went to the Searchers, and there is a sort of arrogance about today's attitudes, where we look back and first of all we tend to stereotype and simplify them as if people weren't thinking of this back then, and we're the first people to discover racism. Well, I mean, if you fought a civil war about slavery, I think people have been thinking about racism quite clearly. They might not have come to the same conclusions as you, but those thoughts are abroad. Those thoughts are around. Those discussions are happening. Frederick Douglass is writing before any Western has been made. So
yes,
these ideas are available to you. The contradictions of racism are available to you from the founding fathers to the present day. So I don't think it's either a point of defense or a point of attack to just say, people didn't think like that in those days. It was around. It was around, and it was open to discussion. It was open to debate. And you could see that by the fact that people like John Wayne and John Ford would get into arguments with other filmmakers, and indeed with each other. And someone like Ward Bond, who was a big member of the John Ford group, was much more virulently right-wing than Ford was, even though Ford was fairly right-wing at the time. You also got to remember that Ford is a fairly recent immigrant to America. He's an Irish immigrant who's literally off the boat. So he's a little bit more like DiCaprio's character in Gangs of New York, who's sort of, his Americanism is freshly won, so to speak. I also wanted to say that there's a brilliant shot in Searchers, to go back to the cinema element, where we see Ethan, who is the John Wayne character. He goes into a place where kidnapped women have been recovered by the army and are being held in some sort of hospital/asylum as they're recovering. Obviously, they have been traumatized by sexual violence, which was a historical fact. He says something very racist, because they say, someone says, "Oh, these white women are suffering," and he says, "I don't see any white women." But then, as he's leaving, he sort of turns around and he looks, and there's this amazing zoom that comes up to his face as he looks back, and the look in his face of being haunted and himself traumatized is so humane and empathetic. It's so, this is a guy who has built bulwarks of hatred around him. And that hatred is based on that virulent racist idea of protecting women. And we don't need to say this in 2025. You're talking from the UK, in which the protection of our girls is once more being chanted on the streets in support of racism. So that's he's protecting his worldview in that way. And then you see the fragility of that. You see the basis of that is actually quite fragile. And so when he saves Natalie Wood at the end and you think he might actually kill her,
yeah,
that's on a knife edge, that decision. And he chooses not to be too much of a hippie, but he chooses love. He chooses reconciliation.
I think that's perhaps the better word. I don't think John Wayne was necessarily a peace and love man, but yeah, absolutely. And this again belies the idea that 1950s. I mean, look, every decade there is some hot garbage out there, and in the 1950s it did tend to be a bit more cuddly and straightforward. But if you look, you will find really. I mean, personally, you're going to shoot me for this. I am not a huge fan of Hitchcock, but obviously he's doing some of his most interesting, almost perverse work in the 1950s, and that was mainstream as well. So yes, of course, there was more nourishing storylines and character work in the 1950s, and I think that this is a good example of that. People do talk a lot about the cinematography, but there's a reason why The Searchers is considered a classic piece of Hollywood. You've got everything there. It is a genuinely good story with genuinely good acting. Yes. John Wayne is an example of a film star that doesn't really exist anymore. But you had your Robert Mitchums, the Cary Grants, all these they sort of like these very patriarchal people, and you're paying to see them be the same person in a different situation. I guess Schwarzenegger could have been one of the last people like that. Anytime he wasn't just like the muscle-bound killing machine, the movie didn't tend to do as well. But if he's a muscle-bound killing machine, but with children, then Kindergarten Cop does well, or Predator, or whatever. And so it's the same thing here. And so you got to admire John Wayne taking that, the cowboy, the guy who would rather sleep with his horse than with a woman kind of thing. But he's adding these extra layers of potential fragility, racism. He is not an instantly likable character as he is in, Rio Grande or She Wore a Yellow Ribbon or whatever. This is proper Hollywood, if you like. This is cinema as an art form that is both entertaining and impressive and complex. So you get that. There is the term for Westerns, horse puncher. And it's like, yeah, a lot of them are, but this isn't one of those.
Excellent. True. And let's talk about somebody who is and has been a movie star of that caliber and is often seen as the rival to John Wayne for whatever the cowboy hat version of a crown is. Clint Eastwood.
Yeah, Clint Eastwood, discuss. I mean, obviously there's the great fact that you can say that even though he did, I think it was 10 Westerns, he never shot a Native American in any of them. He is still making movies. That is the insane thing. John Wayne did actually win an Oscar for Best Actor, but he's certainly never even been nominated for Best Director. Eastwood has won 2 Best Director Oscars, and he's never even won it for being in front of the screen. And not all of his westerns are great. Hang 'em High.
Robert Redford as well, by the way. Robert Redford won an Oscar for Ordinary People, and he was only nominated as an actor for The Sting, which is not by any stretch of the imagination his best role.
No, I absolutely agree. And isn't it interesting how you got these, Redford sadly, just passed away, but, you've got these people who are pillars of Hollywood, and yet they owe a lot of their debt of gratitude to the Western, which everybody's looking down on. I actually found, doing the research on the spaghetti Western trilogy, the Dollars trilogy, kind of hard, and it then dawned on me what happened was they got released in the year of production in the rest of the world, but it took years to get them released in America. So from the point of view of Americans, they'd probably seen Clint Eastwood in three rather impressive Westerns and then saw Where Eagles Dare. And it's just sort of like, oh, yeah, he's still making exciting action movies. Whereas to the rest of us, it's sort of like, no, those films came out years ago and he's evolved into Richard Burton awesomeness, shooting Germans. So one of your colleagues did one. It was the person who wrote, or interviewees, I should say, who wrote the book about Eastwood, and then just
Sean Levy.
Where Eagles Dare is beloved in Britain, barely known in America. It's a Sunday afternoon classic, which of course, as a good parent, I brought my boys up with. But anyway, Eastwood, I've recently seen, it's not a Western, but The Gauntlet. There's an example of a movie that people don't talk about with Eastwood. He was able to do really interesting, movies like Play Misty for me, if we're sort of going back, or, Bridges of Madison County, or Unforgiven, or Pale Rider. These are really interesting films, but also he can do one with orangutans as well. So I think he is sort of, people forget how interesting he is in terms of finding projects. That doesn't mean everything works. The man's in his 90s still making movies, and interesting movies. I think Juror Number 2 is probably one of his best he's done for years. And it was a real shame that for some reason in America, they decided to put it on, Max rather than release it, because I think people would have gone to see that. Every person I've shown that movie, they're going, that's really good. And yeah, it's been a long time since we've seen. Interestingly, the courtroom drama is a bit like the Western. Go back to the 1990s, those would do very well in the cinema. Today, you're going to see them on TV, basically. It's a Netflix mini series sort of thing, rather than, everybody's queuing around the block to see the next courtroom drama or Western.
I think that's a couple of things I wanted to come back to, actually. The spaghetti westerns, the reason they're delayed, of course, is because of a court case with Akira Kurosawa claiming quite rightly that Yojimbo is the precedent for Fistful of Dollars. One thing you said earlier was, that you have these remakes of these samurai films. Magnificent Seven is another example. But what isn't noticed as much is that Kurosawa was a big fan of westerns, so he was also, before he makes Yojimbo, before he makes Seven Samurai, he's thinking, I want to make westerns, but with samurais. So there's much more sort of cross-fertilization which is happening than simply American directors suddenly falling in love with Akira Kurosawa's films. Although, why shouldn't they? They're amazing.
Exactly. And it is interesting that, I don't think I put this in the book because I didn't want to go too much into the, you'll occasionally see on things like Twitter or whatever, it's like, what's your favorite Western? And somebody puts on Seven Samurai. It's like, oh, bravo, but that's clearly not a Western, is it? Anyway, but, Kurosawa has got into trouble with film critics in Japan for being too Western. So we find them accessible and we get it, but that getting it is sort of like offensive to purists in Japan. But it does show you the international language that is. I stumbled across Dersu Uzala. You've got Akira Kurosawa in the Soviet Union making a Russian movie. It's like, okay, fine. And then you've got, proudly, you got like George Lucas and Coppola in front of Kagemusha as well. It's like, because they grew up on the stuff, so they're going to give him money to make another great samurai film. There is this wonderful cross-breeding going on there. And then back to Eastwood, he knew that this was based on Yojimbo and was specifically told, tone it down. Maybe nobody will notice. Again, showing how fast and loose spaghetti westerns were. They didn't know it was going to be a big hit. They thought it would make a bit of money. There's no way Japan's ever going to have this film there, but it blew up, and then they get the problems. I can't remember if I put it in the book, but Kurosawa's been on the record saying, I made more money from the distribution rights in Asia of a fistful of dollars than I did from any of my own movies, which is a great. I don't know if that's actually true, but it's a very good line to throw out.
Yeah, it's in the Christopher Frayling book as well. So I think it's a pretty solid piece of either anecdotage or it's true.
Yeah,
The
yeah.
the films that you mentioned earlier with Clint Eastwood, The Gauntlet specifically, and I'm thinking also a little bit of Dirty Harry, throw open another idea, which is that the Western doesn't really fall out of popularity. I mean, we've talked about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, and that comes out in 1969, the same year as The Wild Bunch, the
Yes.
same years in which the spaghetti westerns are really ruling the roost, and you can see the spaghetti western influence certainly in the Wild Bunch. It becomes like every western film now is an end of the West film. Every film in Once Upon a Time in
Yes.
the West, the railroad arrives, and that's the end of the West, and everybody has to go and die or leave because there's no future for anybody in this town who's an actual archetypal cowboy. By the way, I read a brilliant review by David Thompson talking about Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, comparing it to the Wild Bunch and saying the Wild Bunch
Hmm.
smells of corpses, Butch Cassidy smells of cologne.
Yeah, yeah, that's pretty good. I like that. Yeah, and it is interesting. They're so different, and they come out the same year, and they're in the same genre as well. But it is interesting that once the spaghetti westerns kind of get the stranglehold on it, you've got people like Lee Van Cleef. I want to say Sabata. No, it isn't
Yeah, it is.
Sabata.
It is Sabata.
No, well, no. There's one where it's his first movie back in America. It's not Sabata because he's playing a ferryman,
Oh,
and I saw it.
Baquero.
Thank you.
Baquero.
Yeah, and it's like if you didn't know it was filmed back in America, you couldn't tell that. They are filming it exactly the same way as now the spaghetti western Europe has taken over America in terms of this is how you tell these stories, which I found really, really interesting. Some of these films, look, there is no way I can put every single Western in a book. Okay, it would just turn into sort of an encyclopedia, if you like. So Baquero isn't in there. One that I discovered after I wrote the book was, again, this is just a lot of these are sort of sitting around just on YouTube, but it's the Oxbow incident, and that's
So good.
basically it's really good, and it's basically 12 angry men on horses. It's sort of a courtroom drama, or a moral
Henry Fonda's in
dilemma.
it.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So it's a great film. It's slightly less than 90 minutes, and it's a courtroom drama with horses, and it's like, is that the same genre as The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly? Well, yeah, but tonally, it's very, very different. But yeah, that's a great film, and again, it's just free on YouTube.
Baquero, I would absolutely fully recommend. I think that's a stonking film. It's got
Yeah,
some great dialogue. It's so well written. And Lee Van Cleef, almost all of his spaghetti westerns, they get cheaper and cheaper and cheaper as you go, but all of
yes,
them are well worth watching just for him. Death Rides a Horse. There's some
yes,
crazy theatrics in all of them. They all tend to be quite harsh, and as you were saying with Burnt Tomahawk, some of them kind of glide into horror territory. There's
yeah,
some
yeah.
giallo elements to some of them, or certainly the theatrics of the cruel. But yeah, I really would encourage people to dip into more Lee Van Cleef because he's well worth it. He's never given a bad performance. I mean,
Absolutely. And they are kind of similar characters, I guess, a bit like Eastwood. But the thing that always separates it is he was a big pipe smoker. So in every movie, he's smoking a different pipe. So that's how you can he's got the big one in this movie, or he's got the small one. Anyway, yeah. So lots of pipe action.
So we go up to let's go up to the present day, because I think the present day we could probably mark the 90s and Unforgiven as like the last real high watermark of
Yes.
the cinema western. That's one that wins Oscars. It's kind of universally praised. Although I remember Roger Ebert being a little bit lukewarm on it on one of his TV reviews. But it's a really good classic Western. It kind of has its cake and eats it in terms that it's revisionist, but then in the
Yes.
final 10
Yes.
minutes, it's like, screw this, I'm just going to shoot everybody.
But it is. I hear you on that. But it's still revisionist-ish in the sense that they are really close to each other when they're shooting, and outside it is pitch black. So I mean, you can feel the dirt under your fingernails, which absolutely didn't happen in the 1950s. Everybody's immaculately. I didn't realize how important these sweat and stubble was in the spaghetti westerns, and the Americans had just never seen it before. And then going back to the 50s, it's like, yeah, I mean, look, we've lauded praise on the Searchers, quite rightly too, but considering he's basically out in the wilderness for like 15 years, he's always freshly shaved, and as you said, sort of smells of cologne, so it's like, you can smell the stench on some of these people in for a few dollars more or what have you. And that's one of the things we love about it, the characterful play of it. So it's really Dances with Wolves that sort of reignites for a good sort of 5-6 years. There was back in the 30s Cimarron that wins an Oscar for Best Picture, and that's it. Everything else, occasionally you might get a director nomination, blah 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 blah, but that's it until we get to Dances with Wolves. So that's nearly 60 years later. And then that launches a whole bunch of other ones that come out, some of them successful, some of them not. It is interesting, talking about the slightly more modern ones, is I see an awful lot of love for Tombstone. Now, Tombstone's a fine Western, but when people are saying, oh, this is the greatest Western ever, Kurt Russell is the greatest cowboy ever, it's like, I don't want to be that guy, so I never reply it. But every time I see that, I think you need to see some more Westerns if you seriously think that's the best this genre has. This year I saw for the first time Pat Garrett and Billy the Kid, and I was really blown away by that. That's Peckinpah at his most visceral, blowing off the heads of chickens. Absolutely cannot do that anymore in a movie. But, I get the idea. It is brutal and horrible and ugly. But you're right. After kind of Unforgiven, I think there's only so many sort of like shootouts that we can see, and it starts fading away. But like every one of these genres, it evolves. We said off mic, I think it was 24 when the American Horizon of Part 1 came out with Kevin Costner, and I wanted to see that because I wanted to put it in the book, and I was in the cinema with one other person, and there was a conversation. It's like, is this? Costner did it with Dances with Wolves. He did it with Open Range. Is he going to do it again? And if you know your Westerns, it's like, wow, you are giving us the greatest hits here. There's a bit of Hawks there. There's a bit of Ford there. There's a bit of Leone there. It's like, yes, yeah, I've got it. It's like, but who is watching those films? I am a middle-aged man with teenage kids. Who is this for exactly? Because people in their 50s are not going to the cinema like they were 10 years ago. And it absolutely flopped. And I'm kind of jealous of you. You don't know this, but you've seen Part 2. I haven't seen Part 2 yet. There's no way to see it in the UK. And of course, there's not going to be a Part 3. Does it end on a cliffhanger, or does it wrap things up?
No, man. No. It ends looking for. I mean, it ends with another looking forward to parts 3 and 4. So
okay.
They have shot something. So there is some. There is obviously a story that is continuing. They obviously have the scripts written. It's just they're commercially don't seem to be viable. But the thing is, I'm a little bit against this idea of. Forecasting whether a film will do well out by examining the audience, because if you were around in 1998, 1999, 2000, and you were trying to sell a movie about the Roman era and gladiators and things like that, people would say,
well, actually, let's do Dances with Wolves. You're right. Dances with Wolves shouldn't have worked at all. And they found it very hard to get the funding for that, and then it blows the doors off. You're right, but also I so can't go into all of this, but my wife works in theatre fundraising, and literally on Friday she was in a meeting with some heads of theatres talking about risk mitigation. And the thing is, if you're going to do a very niche topic by a new director, by a new cast, and a whole bunch of nobody knows who wrote it. It's a rather niche topic. Nobody knows the cast and nobody knows the director. I think it's safe to say Only a miracle will make this make money. However, you could do all of those things, but if you then have Idris Elba as the main character, people will come. So you don't have to change much to kind of make things happen. And I guess the thing with Dances with Wolves is, Kevin Costner in the late 80s was beginning to get heat. So possibly that might have helped him there. And then if you're saying about Gladiator, you're right. But also Ridley Scott hadn't had a bad 90s. So, he could sort of put stuff together. Again,
he had had a great 90s. G.I. Jane, White Squall.
But it made money. These things had made money.
Didn't.
Oh, no, it didn't. And White Squall didn't either. But G.I. Jane, despite the risible reviews, I haven't seen it since the 90s. Have you?
No. Viggo Mortensen's in it as well.
Yeah, he is. So anyway. So look, you're never quite sure, but sometimes you can mitigate things a little bit. And, if you keep getting flop after flop, I guess it's a little bit like the other obvious genre to talk about is superhero movies, because prior to COVID, even really average ones could make a ton of money. Nowadays, yeah, they still can, but they've got to hit the audience. Nobody wanted to see Ant-Man 3 Quantumania. It cost an obscene amount of money. Nobody gave it a good review, and nobody really went to see it, so it ends up losing money. So yeah, we have to be a lot more careful about that. And the Western's been through that era, but as we sort of said, and what I say in the book is, it's evolved. There can now be prestige Westerns. Either it has to be a neo-Western, or it's a prestige Western that's a TV series. So something like Deadwood, or sort of something that combines both the sort of hyper-modern and TV with something like Westworld, for example.
Or American Primal. Or
yeah, I loved American Primeval.
American Primeval, sorry, yes.
Yeah, that was a great series. Yeah. And it did well on Netflix. So, people still have an appetite for it, but it is a hard sell. It seems to get people into the cinema to see it, unless it's Tarantino.
Yeah, I'm still, see, the thing is, I think there's not enough is thought about in terms of, there's something called, pattern fatigue, where pattern exhaustion, that is in archaeology, when you have ceramics and they collect ceramics from a certain culture, and it goes down the decades and the centuries, and at a certain point certain cultures just exhaust the number of patterns they can have, and so it's sort of like the culture stagnates because they've kind of gone through all the patterns they can do with their ceramics, and they need to think of something else, and this is sort of like seen as a thing. And I sometimes think that that's true of cinema as well, is where you go over and over and over again the same genre until it's gonna, we're not going to make another one for 20 years, or we're going to make one or two in the next 20 years rather than 20 or 30 a year. And I think because no one sees that pattern fatigue until it's too late.
Yes.
Conversely, nobody sees the new pattern emerge until it's there. So, for instance, the Blair Witch Project had none of those things that you're talking about. No actors with a name, first-time director, first-time writers, a concept which was completely not it wasn't the first found footage, but it was the first really well done found footage. And boom, you've got this massive hit. And so I think that is something, by its very nature, it's relatively rare. You can't calculate for it, you can't bet on it, but you ignore it at your risk. And certainly as an audience, we should have our our feelers out for these things to happen. And we also need to provide cinemas and platforms in which we're not being averse to risk, because we don't get those films if we're always averse to risk. We have to risk.
100%. Yeah. Yeah. And you can sometimes see some films, particularly by Disney, have been kind of precision decision by committee, sort of precision engineered to be a hit, and they're utterly soulless, lifeless husks. And I love it when they flop, because it's saying, no, people do actually want a spark of creativity or originality to it. You can remix the same old stuff in an interesting way, like with Westerns, but when did Westerns start fading? I think it's pretty obvious. It's in the late 70s. but they've really been a cornerstone of movies for 50 years. So that pattern is sort of like, we have pretty much done everything we possibly can. In the 80s, we get some slightly weird ones. I use the example of the third Back to the Future movie, which is sort of set in the Wild West. But again, you only get it if you've seen some Western movies. You got I very passing, I talk about the Young Gun films, but what was interesting about those were the actors in it. People wanted to see Emilio. That was the 3 years where Emilio Estevez could open a movie. Or indeed, Pale Rider is. I really like Pale Rider. I prefer it over. My brain's now just a bit of a brain fart. I prefer it over the other Eastwood one that they were saying, High Plains Drifter.
Okay.
They're sort of saying a lot of people say it's a metaphysical version of High Plains Drifter. I prefer Pale Rider because I like the idea of, like, is he human or is he the embodiment of vengeance? And I love that kind of that version of it. That's a really cool one. And then we get to the I use the example, you've already said it, of like Mad Max. A guy rides into town, they're under attack by bandits, so he gathers everybody together to fight back. I mean, that is Mad Max too. It is also Stagecoach. It is also The General. It's also Fury Road. You just replace horses with diesel and you're there. And it absolutely works fine. That idea of being outnumbered, in a hostile environment, that's ripe for drama. And then if you get something as visually stunning and exciting and viscerally edited as Mad Max Fury Road, you get something that's considered a modern classic.
Absolutely. And the wilderness becomes the wasteland, and the wasteland becomes the far west, So you can go ahead and have all those tropes and all those narrative beats, the unlikely alliance, the discovery of past atrocities that have happened to the character that have made them hard, all the rest of it. I totally agree. What do you think in terms of the future of the Western then? I mean, we've already seen, as you say, Horizon has performed. By the way, I wrote 2 reviews of both Horizons, parts 1 and part 2, for Sight and Sound, and I nailed my colors to the mast, or the totem pole, perhaps. That I was a huge fan of both, and they both have to be seen on the big screen because they are massive films.
Yes.
So they're wonderful to see in that way. So what do you think? Are we going to look back and say, actually, that was like a stage, and here we are again? Here's another reinvention of the Western, or do you think that's kind of the end of the Western? And if it is, does that mean it's also the end of cinema? Because have we begun as
that's deep. I think cinema's going to keep evolving. There are still big hits coming out. But people's habits are changing undeniably. It seems to have found a happy medium on TV. Fine, that's great. And I do think that we're going to see the occasional prestige one. If Timothée Chalamet has always wanted to make a Western, he'll make one. People will come and see it. It will re-explore. But I think people need to find something new to say. It's also I found it interesting that, again, pre-COVID, you would only see new movies in the cinema. Whereas post-COVID, people are, they realize, it's now 50. The one just recently, 50 years since Jaws came out. I've seen Jaws loads of times, but I've never seen it in the cinema. I went to see it in the cinema, and it was as busy as any other movie I've seen recently. And on the week it came out, it was number 2 in the box office in America. So that shows you that there are enough people appetite. I have never seen The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly on the big screen. I would love to see it on the big screen. And I imagine that if they, at some point, sadly, Clint Eastwood's going to die, and if they start showing some of his best work on the big screen again, that could get people excited about it. There's just a very brief aside. There's a guy I know, he's basically a friend of my son's, and he's just starting a film course. and he really, really wants to understand film. And he goes, I really love Nolan, but when I see him being interviewed, Nolan talks about earlier directors. So I hunt out those directors, and then, they reference earlier directors. And he said a brilliant thing, which is, it seems to me, whatever problem you're facing in making a movie, somebody has already faced that problem and come up with the solution. So I just need to watch as many films as I can, and I'll get there. And so 2 films that I sort of sat down with him to watch, going, well, first of all, he didn't have them in physical copy. And secondly, it's like, they're 3 hours. I'm not sure I want to see them. I watched the Seven Samurai with him and The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly with him. And on both occasions, as the credits started rolling at the end, he goes, yeah, those are classics. No argument whatsoever. This is a 19-year-old guy seeing, something black and white from Japan with subtitles, or, something that was cheap and cheerful from Spain, 60 years ago or whatever. And he's like, yeah, that's almost what I want to make. And I know that people use the big showdown of the 3-way sort of Mexican standoff at the end of The Good, the Bad, the Ugly as an example of how music and editing can make things incredibly dynamic, because for 4 minutes, all it is just really standing doing thing. But because of Morricone and because of the editing and the very slow zoom up to the eyes, it is some of the most exciting cinema of nothing happening ever made. And I miss that kind of stuff. You sometimes get, a Villeneuve creating a visual treat for us, well done on the Dune movies, by the way. No, they're not Westerns, even though there's lots of sand. That's a hard sell. But that kind of, that playfulness with the camera, the sort of like, we are doing high opera here. I think sometimes people have come from TV or Netflix streaming, and their vision is very precise. It's technically competent, but it lacks that kind of theater, for want of a better word, that some of the very, very best Westerns. I'm going to say Leone's the best Western director around. So apologies to Hawks and Ford and others. You're good. You're very, very good. But there's just something about his, I think, the sort of like the sheer scale and the visceral nature of it. He's the one person who can combine the blood and guts with the just the sheer imagery of a Western, which is ironic for an Italian filming in Spain.
Yeah, he's at the same time grandiose and pithy. There's an amazing combination to be, when you have 6 minutes of 3 cowboys waiting for 3 gunmen waiting for a train, and you're absolutely rooted to it. And by the way, you mentioned there's no score in that opening 6 minutes, and it's not true. Ennio Morricone scored it. It scored the buzzing of the fly, the creaking, the telegraph. All of that is Ennio Morricone. All of that is Ennio Morricone.
Okay.
Because Morricone, he could be the sort of Mantovani plush sort of string meister, which you have it in Once Upon a Time in the West in full evidence, but he could also be, and this is less, you hear it in his soundtracks. You hear it on the Mission soundtrack, for instance. You hear it in the desert theme in Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. He was also a modernist who wanted to experiment with music and wanted to break through music. He was a crazy guy because he was a brilliant melodist. He knew how to write an amazing melody, but he hated melodies because he thought it was easy and sentimental, and he wanted to do stuff which pushed the boundaries. And then you have that pithy line, did you bring a horse for me? Looks like we didn't bring a horse. Oh no, you brought too many. And
yes.
And then the shootout lasts 10 seconds, compared to all that time you've put up. I mean, I would come back with talking to your friend and how to make films and what perhaps people are lacking, directors are lacking, especially someone like Villeneuve, who is someone I admire and sort of get equally frustrated with, is that and Zack Snyder is another one. Less so. I think Nolan is the genuine article. I think he can do everything. But Leone could do an action sequence, but he also could do a story, and he can also set up character, and he can also do the
Yeah.
connective tissue that you need in a film, so that when you get to the end, it's fully earned. It's not just an action sequence that he's done very well. It's the
Yes.
whole of the film justifies that ending, and the beginning is setting up the next scene, and the next scene is setting up that scene, and it has this holistic. He has a holistic vision of the universe of the film is taking place in. He used to study painting, like Goya and Greco and people like that, and for the lighting, so that he would work out what the lighting references were. He would also study, you know, loads of memorabilia from the period and photographs, and you will see sometimes little things that he did, like the Eli Wallach character putting together his own customized version of a gun from
Yes.
various different parts, which is just like beautiful scene once more, as historically inaccurate as that might have been at the time.
Yeah, yeah,
Um,
again, I'm not being a spoil sport here. It's a great scene. I
isn't
don't
it?
care
Isn't
about
it?
the history there. Yeah.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well,
But it's interesting. You mentioned
yeah,
Nolan there. Just one last thing to
sure.
say. Look, he's gone from sci-fi movies and comic book movies, and then he's just done Oppenheimer, and now he's about to do the Odyssey, the oldest story in European history and literature. What happens if the next one is a Western? He's the sort of person where people absolutely follow him wherever he goes. So if he's suddenly got a hankering to do, some kind of Western, he would A, be given all the money in the world to do it, and B, it would probably do well at the box office. And people who haven't seen Westerns would go and see it just because it's Nolan. That's an interesting concept.
Let's sprinkle that seed out there. I know that Ridley Scott wanted to do Cormac McCarthy's Blood Meridian, and that's one of those lost films that I would so love to see. I would give up his version of Robin Hood in a trice, not only to see that film,
So would I.
even if he's not making Blood Meridian, I'd just give it up anyway.
Yeah, I think that's a more than a fair trade. Yes.
I mean, Blood Meridian is ultra violent, so I think that was part of the problem. Like, they couldn't find a workable way of making something that would be filmable and also true to the book, because ultimately, yeah, it's a very harsh vision of life in a sort of mythical, ultra-violent West. I mean, that's the other thing, isn't it? I mean, life was violent in the West, etc., etc., but there's always an exaggeration of violence as well in these
100%, yeah. That you would, if you only watched Westerns, you think that every Saturday night there would be a massive bar fight, and probably every other week there would be some sort of shootout at high noon. And basically that's just made up by Hollywood. People did not arrange high noon, we're going to stand there and have a gunfight. The gunfight at OK Corral, I go through in quite a lot of depth to show you what actually can we say happened, what do you actually see in movies, and it's 30 seconds of basically anarchy. It's incredibly uncinematic. It is interesting how we know more about that era. It's one of the few times we know more about that era from movies and assume that we know what cowboys look like, for example, than actually what happened in history. We don't make that mistake with the medieval era because there just aren't enough movies that showed that era, and we kind of already know that that's a bit wrong.
Just to go back for a second, and then we'll wrap it up. But Wyatt
Sure.
Earp, people talk about Tombstone. I actually think Kevin Costner's Wyatt Earp is far superior to Tombstone, and
I think it's a superior movie. I don't think
yeah.
it's as much fun.
Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, okay, but fun is overrated. Who wants to have who wants to have fun?
But again, the way people talk about Tombstone, you'd think that it is the single greatest Western ever made. And it's like in the same year there was a superior version of that story. Wyatt Earp. I was one of the 3 people who went to see that in the cinema.
Yeah, and I mean, there's a brilliant film with Jason Robards and James Garner called Hour of the Gun, which is essentially a sequel to Gunfight at the OK Corral. And I think Jason Robards is Doc Holliday, and James Garner is
Okay.
Wyatt Earp, and it's fantastic. If you ever get the opportunity, that's another super film to track down. Well, listen,
So what's it called again? What's it
it's
called
called
again?
Hour of the Gun.
Hour of the Gun. Okay, it's on the list.
I want to say,
Cool, lovely.
I think it's a late 50s or early 60s film.
Sure.
And I'm just checking because I want
Listeners, John is now just checking, presumably on
Cool.
IMDb or whatever.
1967.
Oh, it's a later one. Okay.
So it is later. It's closer to Butch Cassidy. James Garner is Wyatt Earp. Jason Robards is Doc Holliday. He's always good, Jason Robards. And Robert Ryan is Ike Clanton. So it must be them. They must have the gunfight at the OK Corral as well.
They've got to.
Yeah, because otherwise it'd be flashbacks. But I saw it a long time ago, but I really enjoyed it. I've got a feeling I saw it on Moviedrome. I got a feeling it was a Moviedrome cult classic.
Okay, all right.
Yeah, Alex Cox. He's another one who's made a Western, actually.
What's that?
Straight to Hell, starring Joe Strummer.
Let's get the Clash in there, shall we?
Yeah,
why not?
And we didn't even mention Jim Jarmusch's Dead Man, which is another great revisionist.
No, we didn't.
That's a superb Western.
Something just really different. Johnny Depp sort of like not doing the Lone Ranger there as well, so that's quite nice. So I mean, this thing, it's so flexible. We didn't even talk about Calamity Jane and it's sort of like lesbian undertones and music. This is how flexible the genre can be. It could be horror, indie, etc. And I think that if you love your movies, you probably already do love westerns. But hopefully in our conversation here, it might inspire some people to watch some of the less well talked about westerns.
Let's hope so. Fingers crossed. Well, listen, Jem, thanks so much for coming on the show and talking.
Always a pleasure.
Me. Do you have a book recommendation for us?
You always do this, and the thing is, though, you speak to such lauded individuals. It's sort of like you've already mentioned the obvious ones that I would mention. So I am going to do something that I think is very important. I'm going to mention this excellent writer called John Bleasdale, who's written 2 books called The Magic Hours and Darkness Visible, because you do a very good job of promoting them when they first come out, but it's been a while, and they still exist as books, and they're excellent. Okay, now, to be honest, I'm halfway through Darkness Visible. We'll see if it goes off the rails later on, but
it ages like fine milk.
But The Magic Hours I have read all the way through. These are superb books by a guy who really knows his stuff and also really loves his topic as well. So guys, if you haven't, one way to support the podcast is absolutely buy John's books.
Oh man, Jem, that's brilliant. On that bombshell. Take care.
Yeah, you take care.